there is a certain kind of silence that doesn't feel peaceful. It's the silence of a place that used to be loud. Machines running, shift whistles blowing, kids on bicycles, screen doors slamming, churches full on Sunday morning. What you are about to see is not fiction. These streets are real. The numbers are real. And the people who grew up on these roads, who built their lives here, raised their children here, they are real too. This is northeastern Louisiana, and in 3 of its towns, you can watch in real time what happens when the economy turns its back and never looks again. Bastrop, Louisiana. Every town has a founding story. Most of them involve a brave pioneer, a visionary settler, or a determined congregation of families seeking a new life. Bastrop, Louisiana has none of those things. Now, Bastrop was founded by a con man. His real name was Philip Hendrik Nering Boegel. He was born in 1759 in what is now Suriname, a Dutch colony in South America. He moved to the Netherlands, worked as a tax collector in the province of Friesland, and promptly embezzled somewhere in the neighborhood of 250,000 guilders from the provincial treasury. When the auditors came knocking, he was already gone. Dutch authorities posted a reward of 1,000 gold ducats for his capture. Philip Hendrik Nering Boegel sailed to Philadelphia, reinvented himself as a nobleman, and gave himself a new name, Felipe Enrique Neri, Baron de Bastrop. By 1795, he had arrived in Spanish Louisiana, a territory so vast and so wild that no one could easily check his credentials. He was charming. He spoke 4 languages. He dressed the part. And he convinced Spanish colonial governor Baron de Carondelet to grant him 1 million acres of land along the Ouachita River in northern Louisiana, on the condition that he settle 500 families on it within a few years. He settled barely a fraction of that number, lost the grant, and eventually moved to Texas, where, ironically, he found his greatest success as a legitimate intermediary between American colonists and the Mexican government. He helped Moses Austin gain land rights in Texas, and it was Moses Austin's son, Stephen F. Austin, who became one of the founding fathers of the state of Texas, and for whom the capital city of Austin is named. The Baron de Bastrop died in 1827 in Saltillo, Mexico. He never stopped claiming to be a nobleman. 2 towns, one in Louisiana and one in Texas, and an entire Texas county bear his name. It is perhaps fitting that a city built on a false foundation would struggle to hold itself up. The Rise, a company town. For most of the 20th century, Bastrop was a company town in the truest sense of that phrase. In 1921, International Paper Company built its first mill here, then a second. By the mid-1900s, the mills employed hundreds of workers, producing everything from craft paper and envelopes to fluff pulp for diapers. International Paper accounted for more than a quarter of Morehouse Parish's entire economy. Then there was the chicken. Pilgrim's Pride, the brand you still see in grocery stores across America, ran a major processing plant here as well, employing workers across the lower skill wage spectrum for a blue-collar worker in northeastern Louisiana. Bastrop was a place of genuine opportunity. A union wage at the paper mill could support a family, buy a house, send a kid to college. The population peaked in 1980 at over 15,000 people. And then, the world changed. The collapse. On November 21st, 2008, International Paper announced the indefinite closure of its Louisiana mill in Bastrop. The reason given was simple and devastating in equal measure. There was no longer a market for what the mill produced. Its largest customer had been China, and when the global economy contracted, Chinese orders stopped. Governor Bobby Jindal deployed state workforce teams to Bastrop. He told reporters, and these were his exact words, that the mill would only reopen if there was, quote, a dramatic change in the world economy. That dramatic change never came. 3 months later, Pilgrim's Pride announced the closure of operations across the region, including facilities near Bastrop. The combined loss represented hundreds of jobs. The largest employer of low to medium skilled workers in the entire area, gone in the span of one winter. One economist at the University of Louisiana at Monroe put it plainly. He said, "These workers don't have as many resources to leave the area for opportunity as did workers at other companies." Meaning, the people who lost their jobs at International Paper and Pilgrim's Pride weren't the ones who could pack up a laptop and find remote work in Austin or Atlanta. They were the people this town was built for, and the town had failed them. The numbers. Today, Bastrop's population has fallen below 10,000, a drop of nearly 40% from its peak. Now, the numbers that remain tell a story that doesn't need much elaboration. Median household income, $30,069 per year, approximately $578 per week. Overall poverty rate, 42.4% of the population. Children in poverty, 56% of school-aged children. Crime rate, 50 incidents per 1,000 people, more than double the national average of 23. Median home value, $85,400. Racial breakdown, 79% black, 17% white, 1% Hispanic, 3% mixed or other. Cost of living index, 77, 23% below the national average. Over half the children in this city live in poverty, 56%. That number should stop you. Because childhood poverty doesn't stay in childhood. It follows people for the rest of their lives, in health outcomes, in educational attainment, in mental health, in life expectancy. The median home value in Bastrop is $85,400, and in most American cities, that wouldn't buy a parking space. But in Bastrop, you can buy an entire house, and you have to ask yourself why anyone would want to. To be fair to Bastrop, this is not a city of only abandoned houses and empty lots. People still live here. Churches still hold services. Small businesses still try. There are pockets of life, of effort, of pride. But even the people who love this place, and there are many who do, tend to acknowledge the weight of what has happened here. A former resident on social media described it this way: when you grow up here, you can feel it in the air. The people who can leave often do. I was born in Bastrop in 1991. We moved to California in 1993. Every time I travel back home and see the declining condition, I thank God my mom left. Former Bastrop resident International Paper built this city for nearly a century. And when it left, it took almost everything with it. One question that comes up when people watch footage of rural Louisiana is, with all this land, all this green, all this growing season, why isn't someone farming their way out of this? It's a reasonable question. Louisiana is one of the most ecologically fertile states in America. Things grow here that barely survive anywhere else. The comment sections fill with suggestions. Plant nut trees, grow avocados, sell strawberries. The reality is harder. Modern agriculture is capital intensive. You need equipment, land, storage, transportation infrastructure, and access to markets. You also need to compete with industrial-scale farms that can produce at volumes no small community operation can match. The agricultural answer is real, but it isn't simple and it isn't fast. What Bastrop actually needs is what every abandoned company town needs: a new anchor, a new reason for people to stay, And that, as city after city across the American South has discovered, is the hardest thing in the world to find. Oak Grove, Louisiana, West Carroll Parish. Population, 2020, 1,441. Peak population, 1980, 2,214, 40 miles northeast of Bastrop. The character of the land changes, but the story doesn't change much. Oak Grove, Louisiana. Population 1,441. The parish seat of West Carroll Parish. If Bastrop is a city in visible distress, Oak Grove is something more complicated. A small town that has lost nearly a third of its population since 1980, but hasn't entirely given up. West Carroll Parish was carved out of the original Carroll Parish in 1877. The same year, federal Reconstruction troops left Louisiana, and white political leaders in the state moved quickly to redraw parish lines in ways that consolidated power. East Carroll Parish, which had large cotton plantations and a majority black population, became one entity. West Carroll, with more white residents, became another. Oak Grove didn't become the official parish seat until 1915, winning a contested election over a rival town called Pioneer by a slim margin. With the seat came the courthouse, and with the courthouse came commerce. By the early 20th century, Oak Grove was a railroad town, a timber town, and an agricultural hub. A man named Donald Fisk opened a state-of-the-art cotton gin and sawmill here, becoming one of the largest employers in the parish. In 1950, he opened the Fisk Theater, which was described at the time as the most modern movie theater in the American South. That theater is still standing. It's one of the last remaining single-screen historic theaters in all of Northeast Louisiana. What held and what didn't, unlike Bastrop. Oak Grove never had a single industrial anchor that could collapse and take everything with it. Its economy was always more agricultural: cotton, corn, soybeans, rice. That diversity didn't make it rich, but it may have made it more resilient. The numbers here are still sobering by most standards, but they look different next to what we just saw in Bastrop. Their median household income, $35,917 per year, approximately $690 per week. Overall poverty rate, 15.8%, far below Bastrop's 42.4%. Children in poverty, 13%. Crime rate, 20 incidents per 1,000 people, below the national average of 23. Median home value, $86,600. Racial breakdown, 73%. White, 23% black, 1% Hispanic, 1% Pacific Islander. Cost of living index, 76, 24% below the national average. A poverty rate of 15.8% is not something to celebrate. But compare it to Bastrop's 42%, or to Lake Providence, which we'll visit next, and it reads almost like a success story. Oak Grove has something Bastrop doesn't: a hospital. And in rural America, a hospital isn't just a healthcare facility. It's one of the largest employers in town. It's often the most stable employer in town. And when people ask why some small towns survive and others don't, the presence or absence of a regional medical center is frequently the answer. Viewers of footage from Oak Grove often note something that doesn't fit the narrative. The grass is mown. The yards are kept. There are large, well-maintained ranch-style homes on some streets. And then, a block later, an abandoned modern house that somehow costs less than you'd imagine. That contrast is part of what makes Oak Grove harder to categorize than Bastrop. This isn't a ghost town. It isn't thriving. It is somewhere in between. A community holding on through agriculture, through a hospital, through institutional anchors that Bastrop no longer has. One demographic detail that surprises most outside observers. Oak Grove's population is roughly 1% Pacific Islander, in a rural Louisiana town of 1,400 people. That translates to only about 14 individuals. But it's enough to register. And it's a reminder that even the smallest and most remote American towns are more diverse than a single statistic can capture. Oil, cotton, and the 1980s. Why did so many Louisiana towns peak in 1980 and then begin to decline? The answer isn't one thing. It's two things, happening almost simultaneously. The first was oil. In 1980, crude oil prices hit $35 a barrel, equivalent to over $130 in today's money. Louisiana was intoxicated by the boom. Oil and gas revenues made up nearly 40% of the state budget. Towns that had nothing to do with petroleum still benefited indirectly through the state tax revenue that funded schools, roads, and services. Then, in 1986, the bottom fell out. A global oversupply crashed prices. Louisiana's unemployment rate hit 13.2%, the highest in the country. The second was the transformation of American agriculture. Cotton, which had anchored northeastern Louisiana for a century and a half, became increasingly mechanized and industrial. A farm that once required dozens of workers could now be operated by one man and a GPS-guided machine. The agricultural labor that sustained small towns evaporated. Not because there was no demand for cotton, but because there was no longer demand for the human hands that used to grow it. Oak Grove survived this transition better than many of its neighbors. But surviving and thriving are different things. Lake Providence, Louisiana East, Carroll Parish. Population, 2020, 3,587. Peak population, 1980, 6,361 to understand Lake Providence. As you have to understand where it sits in the geography of America's great river. Lake Providence is in East Carroll Parish, in the absolute northeast corner of Louisiana, pressed against the Arkansas border, pressed against the Mississippi River. It is, in many ways, the end of the road. The final dot before the map becomes Arkansas. The town takes its name from the lake, an oxbow lake, formed thousands of years ago when the Mississippi River changed course and left behind a crescent of still water 6 miles long. It is, by any measure, one of the most beautiful bodies of water in Louisiana. Cypress trees line its banks. Herons stand in the shallows. On a still morning, the surface reflects the sky like a mirror. And yet, Lake Providence is the poorest town we will visit today. Pirates on the Mississippi. The story of how this town got its name is the most cinematic of the three we're visiting today. In the early 1800s, the Mississippi River was the highway of the American interior. Longboatmen and keelboat crews would float goods downriver from Kentucky, Ohio, and Tennessee. Furs, grain, whiskey, cotton, headed for New Orleans and the world beyond. And on a particular bend in the river, just north of where Lake Providence now sits, there was a pirate. His name was Bunch. History doesn't give us his first name, just Bunch. He and his crew occupied this treacherous curve in the river, a place where the current forced boats close to the bank, where the trees were dense enough to hide a dozen men, where there was no escape route and no way to outrun what was coming. They would raid the boats, kill the crew, and sell the cargo. If a crew managed to navigate Bunch's Bend with their lives and their cargo intact, they considered it nothing less than a divine miracle. They would say they had made it to Providence, that the Lord had spared them. The trading settlement that grew below that bend took that name, Providence. And when the post office required them to distinguish it from Providence, Rhode Island, they added a word, Lake Providence, a town named for the relief of surviving something. Cotton Kingdom and Civil War. By the mid-1800s, Lake Providence sat at the heart of what historians call the Cotton Kingdom, the plantation system of the Mississippi Delta at its height. The land here, the deep alluvial soil deposited by centuries of river flooding, was some of the most fertile in North America, and it was worked almost entirely by enslaved people. East Carroll Parish, when the Civil War began in 1861, consisted mostly of large cotton plantations along the river, worked by thousands of enslaved laborers. The wealth generated here was real. The violence required to generate it was just as real. Then came the Union Army. In the spring of 1862, Union forces arrived at Lake Providence, and in early 1863, General Ulysses S. Grant, not yet the celebrated commander he would become, ordered his troops to dig a canal connecting Lake Providence to the Mississippi River. His goal was to create a water route that would allow Union gunboats and supply vessels to bypass the heavily fortified Confederate position at Vicksburg, Mississippi, just 40 miles south. Thousands of Union soldiers dug for months, and the canal was 100 feet wide and 5 feet deep. On March 18, 1863, they cut the levee and let the Mississippi in. It didn't work. The rest of the route proved impractical. Grant eventually found another way around Vicksburg, but the canal survived as an open ditch until 1953, when a senator named Russell Long had it filled in at the request of local residents. Today, about 1,000 feet of it remain, accessible through a well-maintained park with an elevated boardwalk and a view of the lake that makes you understand, in a single glance, why people wanted to call this place Providence, America's poorest lake. Providence has appeared in multiple national studies as one of the poorest communities in the United States, not just in Louisiana. In America, median household income, $24,670 per year, approximately $474 per week. Overall poverty rate, 40.7%. Children in poverty, 61%, nearly 2 in 3 children. Senior poverty rate, 14%. Median home value, $75,200. Racial breakdown, 75% black, 24% white, 1% other. Cost of living, 73. Housing index of just 35. Average median income, alternate source, $16,500, among the lowest in the nation. A median household income of $24,000 a year. That is $474 a week, before taxes. Consider what that means for a family in 2024. Rent, utilities, groceries, gas, healthcare, which in Louisiana costs more than the national average, even while everything else costs less. 61% of children in Lake Providence live in poverty. That is the number that should land. Not as a statistic, and as a reality. 6 out of every 10 children who grow up on these streets begin life already behind. A CNN analysis once called Lake Providence the most unequal place in America. Not because its wealthiest residents are extraordinarily wealthy, but because the gap between the top and the bottom is almost unbridgeable by any local means. The architecture of poverty. Shotgun houses. Throughout Lake Providence and throughout much of rural Louisiana, you'll see a distinctive style of housing that tells its own story. The shotgun house. A shotgun house is defined by its layout. 1 room wide, 2 to 4 rooms deep, all in a straight line from front to back. The name comes from the claim, likely apocryphal but vivid enough to stick, that if you fired a shotgun through the front door, like the blast would pass through every room and out the back without hitting a wall. Shotgun houses were built throughout the American South from the late 1800s through the mid-20th century as low-cost housing for working-class families and formerly enslaved people. In New Orleans, some have been restored into architectural showpieces. In Lake Providence, many are still in active use, still housing families, still providing shelter, in conditions that range from lovingly maintained to barely standing. They are the most visible symbol of the layered economic history of this region. They were built for people who had little, and they still house people who have little. The Art Deco Courthouse and what remains. Lake Providence has a courthouse that, by any architectural standard, is beautiful. Built in 1938, it is a textbook example of Art Deco design, the style that dominated American public architecture during the New Deal era, when the federal government was spending money to put people to work and leave something lasting behind. Clean geometric lines, stylized ornamentation, a sense of permanence and civic pride built into every course of masonry. It sits in a downtown that, around it, is struggling to hold itself together, which is itself a kind of metaphor. The money that built this courthouse came from a moment when the United States government decided that public investment in neglected places was a national priority. That era and that philosophy has come and gone several times since. Each time it returns, and each time it retreats, places like Lake Providence feel both surges. Why it never recovered. Lake Providence sits in the Mississippi Delta, one of the most agriculturally productive regions on Earth, and simultaneously one of the most economically distressed. That paradox has a historical explanation. The wealth generated by Delta agriculture before the Civil War was built on enslaved labor. When emancipation came, the economic system didn't collapse. It transformed into sharecropping, a system that kept black farm workers legally free but economically bound to the same land, the same families, the same debt cycles. For nearly a century after the Civil War, the Mississippi Delta operated as a closed system of agricultural feudalism. The mechanization of cotton farming in the mid-20th century ended that system, but it didn't replace it with anything. The sharecroppers were no longer needed, and the small towns that had existed to serve those workers had no new purpose. And the people who had been held in place by the system now found themselves free to go, but with no economic foundation underneath them. What you see in Lake Providence today is the end result of 2 centuries of decisions made by people who were not from here, for the benefit of people who were not from here, about land that belonged, in every meaningful sense, to the people who are still here. That last observation is one of the most haunting things you notice in all 3 of these towns. The absence of pedestrians. Streets that exist but aren't being used as streets. Life happening somewhere, but not here, not visible, not public. Part of this is car culture, rural America by necessity, and it became a place you drive through rather than walk through decades ago. Part of it is heat. Louisiana in summer is not a place designed for casual strolls. And part of it, in honest acknowledgement, is that public space in deeply impoverished communities often doesn't feel safe enough to use. But part of it, too, is something harder to name. The way that poverty itself becomes private. The way people retreat indoors when the outside world has nothing left to offer them. 3 towns, 1 state, 3 different stories that are, at their core, the same story. Bastrop was built by a company and abandoned by one. Oak Grove was built by agriculture and has slowly hollowed out as that agriculture industrialized. Lake Providence was built on slavery, survived sharecropping, outlasted mechanization. and is still trying to survive a present that provides almost no economic reason for its existence. None of these places failed because their people failed. That is important to say plainly. The people of Bastrop and Oak Grove and Lake Providence did not make decisions that caused the mills to close, the oil to run out, the cotton to stop requiring human hands. Those decisions were made far away, in boardrooms and commodity markets and congressional committees. And when the consequences arrived, they arrived here, in the form of empty buildings, falling incomes, and a silence that doesn't feel peaceful. What these towns need is not sympathy. They have had sympathy. They need investment, industry, infrastructure, educational institutions with pipelines to careers. And they need to be seen not as cautionary tales, but as communities with assets, land, history, architecture, culture, and people with nowhere else to go and no reason to stop caring about where they are. The Baron de Bastrop failed everyone he encountered and still got a town named after him. The people of these towns have failed no one. They deserve better than what they've been given. They deserve to be remembered. If this video changed how you think about any of this, and I really hope it did, the single most useful thing you can do for this channel is subscribe and hit the notification bell. It costs nothing, and it genuinely makes a difference in how many people see the work.